The shuttle descended through the lavender clouds of terraces like a quiet thought slipping into someone else's dream. Connor Blake pressed his forehead lightly against the observation glass and watched the planet unfold beneath him. From orbit, Terraces had looked like a vast emerald mosaic. Up close, it looked even stranger. Hills carved into perfect levels spread across the landscape like enormous staircases, each terrace glowing with rows of bioluminescent plants that shimmered in soft blues and greens. Beautiful, Connor murmured. The diplomatic officer sitting beside him glanced over. Yes, also extremely formal. Connor smiled. Those two things usually go together. The officer did not smile back. Terracian diplomacy, it seemed, was not known for jokes. Connor was not officially a diplomat anyway. He was a linguist, one who specialized in alien languages and, more importantly, alien idioms. Earth's government had decided that if humanity was going to negotiate trade agreements with the Terracian Empire, someone should probably understand the difference between a polite greeting and accidentally challenging their queen to a ritual duel. Connor had been assured that Terracian language was elegant, poetic, and logically structured. What the briefing had failed to mention was that Terracians possessed approximately 9,000 idioms involving plants. The shuttle touched down gently on a circular landing platform grown directly out of living crystal trees. The structure hummed softly, as if the planet itself were pleased about the landing. Connor stepped out into warm air filled with the scent of unfamiliar flowers. The Terracian capital stretched across countless layered gardens. Bridges of pale stone connected terraces covered with glowing vines, towering trees, and flowing streams. Buildings did not appear constructed so much as carefully guided into shape by patient gardeners. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. It was also the most intimidating diplomatic environment Connor had ever seen. A tall Terracian official approached to greet the human delegation. Like all Terracians, she looked almost human at first glance. Pale skin, graceful posture, calm, observant eyes. Then there were the ears. They were long and elegant, curving gently upward past her dark hair like sculpted leaves. Connor tried very hard not to stare. "Welcome to Terraces," she said in flawless English. Connor blinked. "Your pronunciation is better than mine." The Terracian inclined her head slightly. "Our queen believes it is polite to speak in the language of our guests." Connor made a mental note. Queen Lira already sounded like someone who took diplomacy very seriously. The Terracian official turned and began leading the group through the terraces. As they walked, Connor noticed something peculiar. Terracian citizens moved with remarkable quietness. Conversations were calm, measured, precise. Nobody laughed. Connor noticed these things. Connor always noticed these things. They eventually reached the central palace, a sprawling structure woven through several giant trees whose trunks were wider than buildings. Platforms spiraled upward into gardens, floating hundreds of meters above the ground. Connor tilted his head back to see the highest terrace. "Okay," he said quietly to himself. "That's either the palace or a very ambitious treehouse." One of the Terracian guards glanced at him. Connor cleared his throat. "Ambitious treehouse," he repeated softly. The delegation was escorted into a receiving hall made entirely of living crystal branches. Light filtered through the translucent walls, creating shifting patterns across the polished floor. Connor was still studying the architecture when the room suddenly grew quiet. Not polite quiet. Court quiet. Connor followed everyone's gaze toward the far entrance. Queen Lira entered the hall. She moved with the effortless calm of someone who had spent centuries being watched. Her long dark hair fell over silver ceremonial robes that shimmered softly in the filtered light. Her long ears curved elegantly through her hair, giving her an appearance both regal and strangely natural, like she belonged to the gardens themselves. Her eyes moved calmly across the delegation. When they reached Connor, they paused. Not suspicious, curious. Connor suddenly remembered that he was the one human in the room whose job description included occasionally speaking Terracian. He straightened slightly. The queen approached the delegation leader first, greeting him politely in English. Her voice was smooth and composed. Connor listened carefully. The pronunciation was flawless. She greeted the next diplomat in his native language. Then another, and another. Each greeting perfect, each language effortless. Connor realized something fascinating. The queen always spoke the other person's language, never her own. When Queen Lira finally stood before him, the room seemed to grow even quieter. "You are Connor Blake," she said in English. "Yes, Your Majesty." "You study our language." Connor hesitated. "Well," he said carefully, "I try not to insult it." For a moment the queen simply studied him. Then very slightly the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. Connor relaxed a little. Maybe Terracians did appreciate humor. Or maybe he had just survived his first diplomatic conversation without accidentally proposing marriage. On Terraces, Connor suspected both outcomes were equally possible. Connor discovered two important things about the Palace of Terraces during his first day. The first was that Terracian architecture had absolutely no respect for human needs. Every terrace seemed to involve graceful staircases carved into living stone, sloping garden paths, or bridges that curved upward at angles that looked beautiful, but felt suspiciously like a long-term conspiracy against gravity. The second discovery was that Terracians took dinner extremely seriously. Connor realized this when a palace attendant arrived at his guest quarters precisely 3 hours after his arrival. Not approximately 3 hours. Precisely 3 hours. The attendant bowed slightly, long ears tilting forward with elegant precision. "Her Majesty Queen Lira invites the human delegation to attend the evening garden banquet." Connor blinked. "Tonight?" "Yes." Connor glanced down at the data pad full of Terracian linguistic notes he had been studying. The document contained warnings. Many warnings. Formal Terracian dinners are highly structured social events. Improper phrasing may carry unintended ceremonial meaning. Humor should be attempted only by experienced speakers. Connor looked back at the attendant. "Just hypothetically," Connor said, "what happens if someone accidentally uses the wrong idiom during dinner?" The attendant considered this carefully. "Historically," she said calmly, "the worst incident resulted in a minor trade dispute and 3 months of awkward diplomatic silence." Connor exhaled slowly. "Good," he muttered. "That's not so bad." She tilted her head slightly. That was considered a successful evening. Connor decided not to ask further questions. The palace gardens transformed completely once the night arrived. Floating lantern organisms drifted above the terraces like slow-moving stars, casting gentle light across the curved tables arranged between flowering trees. Streams of glowing water flowed quietly along channels carved into the stone, and distant music floated through the warm air. Connor stepped onto the main dining terrace beside the other diplomats, and immediately felt as though he had walked into the most beautiful museum in the galaxy. Everything was perfect. Perfect plants, perfect lighting, perfectly arranged seating, perfectly calm Terracians. Connor looked around the gathering crowd and noticed something subtle. Everyone was speaking politely. Everyone was smiling politely, but no one was laughing. Not a single person. Connor leaned slightly toward the Earth delegation leader. "Is it just me?" he whispered, "or is this the quietest dinner party in the universe?" The ambassador whispered back without moving his lips. "Do not test that theory." Connor nodded. Testing theories was unfortunately one of his favorite hobbies. Queen Lira entered the terrace moments later. The entire gathering stood. Connor followed the motion, trying not to knock over the extremely delicate Terracian chair beside him. The queen moved through the gathering like a calm current through water. Her silver robes reflected the floating lights above, and the faint glow of the garden plants framed her silhouette as she approached the curved table. Her long ears moved slightly as she greeted each diplomat. Connor noticed again what had struck him earlier in the reception hall. She always spoke their language. The first diplomat received a greeting in trade standard, the second in Martian dialect, the third in a fluid clicking language from the outer colonies. Connor leaned back slightly, fascinated. Queen Lira wasn't just multilingual, she was effortlessly multilingual. When she approached Connor's seat, her eyes settled on him with quiet curiosity. "You are adapting well to Terraces," she said in English. Connor nodded. "I only got lost 3 times today." A nearby Terracian noble paused mid-sip. Connor continued carefully. "Your palace gardens are architecturally adventurous." For a moment, Lira simply looked at him. Then her ears lifted slightly in what Connor was beginning to recognize as Terracian amusement. That is a polite way to describe them, she said. Connor leaned slightly closer. I fell down one staircase. You fell? Yes. Lra studied him for a moment longer. Then she spoke quietly. That staircase has claimed many victims. Connor blinked. I feel strangely honored. For just a moment, Connor thought he heard the faintest breath of laughter leave the queen. But it vanished so quickly he wasn't sure it had happened at all. Dinner began. Servants moved gracefully between the guests carrying dishes that looked more like botanical experiments than food. Some plants glowed faintly. Others gently released fragrant steam when cut. Connor examined one dish cautiously. Is this alive? The Terracian noble beside him answered calmly. Only slightly. Connor decided not to ask follow-up questions. Conversation flowed smoothly across the table, but the tone remained extremely formal. Diplomats discussed trade routes, atmospheric harvest technologies, and agricultural engineering methods unique to Terraces. Connor participated where he could, though much of the conversation involved extremely technical discussions about gravity-managed plant ecosystems, which to Connor's disappointment contained zero jokes. At one point, the discussion turned to linguistic preservation among interstellar cultures. Queen Lira spoke thoughtfully about the importance of understanding one another's languages. Connor noticed something again. She still hadn't spoken her own, not once. She used the language of whoever she addressed. Connor tilted his head thoughtfully. For someone whose entire life revolved around language, that felt strange. A queen surrounded by her own people, and yet she never spoke her own tongue. Connor quietly returned to his meal. A small idea had begun forming in the back of his mind. A very dangerous idea, one involving Terracian idioms. Connor had a strong suspicion that trying to tell a joke in Terracian might be the most reckless thing a human linguist could possibly attempt, which unfortunately meant he was already thinking about it very seriously. Connor Blake spent the next 3 days committing what most Terracian scholars would probably classify as linguistic recklessness. The Terracian Royal Library was not a library in the traditional sense. There were no dusty shelves or paper books. Instead, knowledge grew, literally inside towering, crystalline trees whose branches carried thousands of glowing memory pods. Each pod held centuries of language, history, poetry, and, unfortunately for Connor, idioms. Thousands of idioms. Connor stood beneath one of the glowing branches, holding a translator tablet that was already flashing several polite warnings. Reminder, the device said in a calm, synthetic voice, Terracian idioms possess layered contextual meaning. Incorrect usage may cause confusion. Connor rubbed his eyes. Confusion is fine. I'm trying to avoid starting a war. The device paused, recalculating acceptable outcome parameters. Connor reached up and gently tapped a glowing memory pod. The pod brightened, projecting Terracian script into the air around him. Elegant characters floated in slow spirals like drifting leaves. Connor read the translation. When the third vine refuses the sun, the gardener must laugh before the plants do. He frowned. That can't be right. The translator hummed uncertainly. Literal meaning detected. Connor sighed. Of course it's literal. Terracians apparently think agriculture is hilarious. A nearby Terracian scholar turned his head slowly. Connor offered an apologetic smile. Respectfully hilarious, he added. The scholar gave a small nod and returned to studying a glowing botanical manuscript. Connor looked back at the floating characters. Terracian humor, he had discovered, was incredibly old. Most jokes were built on agricultural metaphors that had evolved over centuries. The humor often relied on timing, tone, and extremely subtle pronunciation differences, which meant Connor was essentially attempting linguistic tightrope walking while wearing gravity boots. His translator device chimed again. Additional warning, tonal misplacement may change humorous idiom into historical insult. Connor leaned back in his chair. Do I want to know which historical insult? The translator projected a new line of text. Connor read it silently. Then he slowly lowered the tablet. Nope, I absolutely did not want to know that. He rubbed his face. 3 days. 3 entire days of studying alien jokes. Connor had learned many things. First, Terracians did actually have humor. Second, their humor was extremely subtle. Third, if you mispronounce certain vowel structures, you could accidentally accuse someone's grandmother of sabotaging irrigation canals. Connor leaned forward again and scrolled through another memory pod. The Terracian phrase appeared in glowing characters. Even the most serious gardener laughs when the vines steal the ladder. Connor read it again. Then again. He tapped the translator. Context: used when a carefully planned situation becomes uncontrollable, the device replied. Often delivered during moments of social tension. Connor slowly leaned back. Now that was interesting. He imagined the next royal dinner, the quiet table, the careful diplomacy, the serious ministers discussing plant infrastructure like it was the fate of the universe. Connor grinned slightly. The translator noticed the grin. User facial expression suggests reckless decision. Connor pointed at the floating phrase. This one. Clarification requested. I'm using this one. The device dimmed its lights. Statistical probability of social embarrassment. High. Connor shrugged. I work in diplomacy. That's basically part of the job. The device paused again. Correction? Diplomats avoid embarrassment. Connor leaned closer. Linguists cause it. The translator considered this. Statement appears historically accurate. Connor stood and stretched. He had memorized the phrase now. Mostly. Probably. Hopefully. As he turned to leave the library terrace, he noticed someone standing near the entrance. Queen Lira. She had arrived quietly like most Terracians did, and now watched him with mild curiosity. Connor froze mid-step. He had been caught practicing alien jokes. This was not how professional diplomacy normally worked. The queen approached slowly, her long ears angled slightly forward. You study our language very seriously, she said in English. Connor cleared his throat. I study it very carefully, he corrected. Lyra's gaze shifted briefly toward the glowing memory pod Connor had been using. Idioms are complicated. Connor laughed softly. That is the most polite description anyone has given them. For a moment the queen seemed thoughtful. Then she asked, have you learned any? Connor hesitated. Several Terracian scholars nearby subtly stopped moving. Connor knew what they were thinking. A human attempting Terracian humor in front of the queen was either incredibly brave or deeply foolish. Connor decided honesty was the safer option. One, he admitted. Lyra's ears lifted slightly. Only one? Connor nodded. I was advised not to attempt more. The queen studied him for another quiet moment. Then she said calmly, perhaps you will use it someday. Connor smiled. Oh, I absolutely will. Several Terracian scholars in the room looked suddenly nervous. Connor noticed. Relax, he said cheerfully. What's the worst that could happen? The translator device immediately answered. Multiple diplomatic incidents remain statistically possible. Connor quietly turned the device off. Sometimes it was better not to hear the odds. The second royal dinner on Terraces took place 5 evenings later, though Connor suspected the palace had been preparing for it since the birth of the first Terracian tree. The garden terrace looked even more magnificent than before. Bioluminescent flowers glowed like small constellations woven into the living walls, and slow streams of silver water flowed along channels carved through the stone. Floating lantern creatures drifted overhead, gently pulsing with soft light that shifted between violet and gold. Connor stood near the edge of the terrace beside the human ambassador and quietly reminded himself that this was a diplomatic event, not a comedy stage. His brain, unfortunately, disagreed. You're thinking again, the ambassador muttered without looking at him. Connor blinked. I always think. Not like this. Connor gave an innocent shrug. Across the terrace, Terracian nobles and visiting diplomats moved through the garden with their usual graceful calm. The entire gathering felt like a perfectly balanced machine, where every word, every gesture had been rehearsed over centuries. Connor noticed the same thing he had noticed before. Everyone was smiling. No one was laughing. The ambassador leaned slightly closer. You remember the briefing? Connor nodded. Yes, speak carefully. Avoid idioms. Do not attempt humor. The ambassador gave him a long look. You're absolutely going to attempt humor, aren't you? Connor sighed. I'm a linguist. Curiosity is a medical condition. The ambassador rubbed his forehead. I should have brought a botanist. Connor smiled. A botanist would probably make worse jokes. Have you seen Terracian agriculture metaphors? The ambassador decided to stop asking questions. Queen Lira entered the terrace a few minutes later. The entire gathering rose again as she stepped into the lantern light, her silver robes reflecting the soft glow of the gardens. Her long dark hair moved gently with the evening breeze, and the elegant curve of her long ears gave her a presence that felt both regal and natural, as if she belonged to the living terraces themselves. Connor noticed something immediately. Her eyes moved through the crowd calmly, but when they passed over him, they paused for a brief moment, not disapproving, curious. Connor suspected she remembered their conversation in the library, which meant she might also remember the part where he admitted learning exactly one Terracian idiom. Connor tried to look like someone who had not memorized a dangerous alien joke. He failed slightly. Dinner began soon afterward. Servants carried elegant dishes made from Terrace's living gardens. Fruit that glowed faintly beneath the skin, delicate leaves that released warm, aromatic vapor when touched, and crystalline bowls filled with slowly shifting liquid that looked suspiciously like edible starlight. Connor examined one carefully. Does this one move? He whispered to the Terracian noble beside him. Only if startled. Connor nodded. I will try not to startle my food. The noble studied him for a moment, unsure whether this was humor. Connor continued eating peacefully. The dinner conversation flowed through familiar diplomatic territory, trade agreements, environmental engineering, gravity-controlled agriculture, and atmospheric harvesting technology used to regulate the floating vine forests that surrounded many Terracian cities. Connor listened quietly. Then the conversation reached a moment that felt almost too perfect. One of the Terracian ministers began describing a recent agricultural project involving floating vines that had grown unexpectedly beyond their planned structures. The explanation was extremely technical, very serious. Several nobles discussed irrigation calculations and structural growth algorithms. Connor slowly set down his glass. The moment had arrived. He could feel his translator device in his pocket vibrating gently, as if it sensed danger. Connor ignored it. He cleared his throat slightly. Several diplomats glanced toward him. Connor spoke, not in English, in Terracian. The words came out carefully, his pronunciation cautious but understandable. He delivered the idiom. Even the most serious gardener laughs when the vines steal the ladder. For a moment, the entire terrace stopped breathing. A Terracian noble froze with his drink halfway to his lips. One of the off-world diplomats looked mildly horrified. The ambassador closed his eyes. Connor sat perfectly still. He suddenly realized something important. Terracian grammar had about 17 different tonal variations. He was only about 70% certain he had used the correct one. Queen Lira looked directly at him. Her expression revealed absolutely nothing. Her long ears lifted slightly. Connor wondered briefly if Terracians had prisons made of vines or ladders. Then something happened that no one at the table expected. The queen blinked. Her expression shifted. For a brief moment, she looked almost confused. Then her shoulders moved slightly, and a small surprised laugh escaped her. Not polite laughter. Real laughter. Soft at first, then warmer. The sound drifted across the quiet terrace like a breeze through leaves. Several Terracian nobles stared as if the planet had just changed orbit. Connor remained very still. The queen covered her mouth briefly, still smiling as the laughter faded. Then she spoke in Terracian. Connor immediately noticed something. Her pronunciation was slightly different from his. She gently repeated the idiom, correcting a single vowel. Connor blinked. Oh, he said quietly. That makes more sense. Queen Lira laughed again. This time the sound was impossible to mistake. And somewhere across the enormous garden terrace, the most formal dinner in Terracian history finally stopped being completely silent. The sound of Queen Lira's laughter did something unusual to the garden terrace. It broke the gravity. Connor didn't mean physical gravity, of course. The floating lantern creatures above the table continued drifting peacefully. The elegant Terracian towers still stood where they always had. The stream still flowed in gentle spirals through the terraces. But the invisible weight that had filled every royal dinner conversation until that moment suddenly cracked. Connor realized it immediately. The tension in the air had been like glass, perfect, polished, fragile, and the queen had just tapped it with laughter. For several seconds, no one at the table moved. A Terracian noble slowly lowered his glass, as if sudden motion might disturb the rare phenomenon unfolding before him. Across the table, one of the off-world diplomats blinked twice, clearly unsure whether what he had heard was real. Connor sat very still. He had studied alien languages for 20 years, and yet nothing in his training had prepared him for the moment when a queen laughed at one of his jokes and an entire royal court reacted like someone had opened a portal in the sky. Queen Lira was still smiling, not politely, genuinely. She turned slightly toward Connor again and repeated the idiom in Terracian, this time with flawless pronunciation. Connor listened carefully. "Yes," he said thoughtfully, "that vowel makes it significantly less insulting to agricultural professionals." Several Terracian ministers looked horrified. The queen laughed again. It was warmer this time, easier, like the sound had finally remembered how to exist. Connor relaxed slightly in his chair. "Good," he said quietly. "I was worried I had accidentally challenged the vines to a duel." One of the alien diplomats coughed into his glass. The Terracian minister, who had been explaining the agricultural problem earlier, now looked deeply conflicted between professional dignity and curiosity. Queen Lira rested one hand lightly on the table. "You studied our idioms carefully," she said. Connor tilted his head. Carefully is a generous word. Nervously might be more accurate. "You chose a difficult one." Connor nodded. "I was advised that attempting Terracian humor could start diplomatic incidents. And yet you attempted it." Connor leaned back slightly. "I calculated the odds. And 50% chance of embarrassment, 50% chance of mild cultural progress." The queen's long ears shifted slightly with amusement. "You chose the risk." Connor gave a small shrug. "Human communication strategy." A Terracian noble at the far end of the table spoke quietly to another. Connor caught part of the whisper. "Humans intentionally risk embarrassment." Connor nodded toward them. "Yes, it's one of our finest traditions." Queen Lira smiled again. The smile lingered longer this time. Around the terrace, something subtle began happening. Conversations resumed, but the tone had shifted. The diplomats still discussed trade routes and atmospheric harvest technology, but the rigid precision had softened. A few Terracian nobles spoke more freely. Someone made a quiet observation about vine growth patterns that caused a few nearby guests to smile. It was not chaos. It was simply relaxed. Connor noticed the difference immediately. He leaned slightly toward the ambassador. "Did we just fix something?" The ambassador whispered back. "You nearly caused a cardiac event." "Ah, but possibly a useful one." Connor nodded thoughtfully. "I'll add that to my professional achievements." Across the table, Queen Lira continued watching the subtle transformation of the dinner with quiet curiosity. For the first time since Connor had arrived on Terraces, the court around her felt slightly less like a ceremonial machine and slightly more like a gathering of living people. She looked back at Connor. "You were willing to risk failure in my own language," she said. Connor smiled. "Well, technically I already failed." "How so?" "You corrected my pronunciation." The queen tilted her head slightly. "That was not failure." Connor raised one finger. "It was about 80% success." Queen Lira's eyes brightened again with amusement. "Your people measure success in percentages?" "Only when we survive the experiment." The queen laughed again, softly. Connor glanced around the terrace. Several Terracian nobles were now quietly exchanging comments about idioms. One of them attempted a small joke about irrigation vines. It was not a very good joke, but two people smiled anyway. Connor leaned back in his chair. The garden terrace no longer felt like a silent monument. It felt alive. Above them, the floating lantern creatures drifted slowly through the warm Terracian night, their soft lights reflecting in the flowing water channels that wound through the gardens. Connor studied the queen across the table. For a long time, she had spoken the languages of everyone else. Tonight, because of a single awkward idiom and one slightly misplaced vowel, she had spoken her own language and laughed. Connor lifted his glass. "Your Majesty," he said. "Yes?" I promise my next Terracian joke will be slightly safer. The Queen considered this. I hope not. Connor blinked. Really? She smiled. Vines that steal ladders are rarely safe. Connor thought about that. Then he laughed quietly. For the first time since arriving on Terraces, he realized something important. This court might finally be learning how to laugh again. The royal dinner ended slowly, like a quiet tide retreating from the shore. Diplomats drifted away through the terraces in small groups, their conversations lighter than when the evening had begun. The floating lantern creatures above the gardens dimmed slightly as Terrace's second moon rose over the distant hills, casting pale silver light across the layered gardens. Connor remained seated for a few minutes after the table cleared, partly because the view was extraordinary, partly because he suspected standing up too quickly might cause several diplomats to faint after what had just happened. The human ambassador leaned toward him. You survived. Connor nodded. Statistically impressive. You made the Queen laugh. Connor thought about it. Yes. The ambassador looked across the terrace toward Queen Lira, who was quietly speaking with two Terracian ministers near the edge of the garden. You may have permanently altered Terracian court protocol. Connor raised an eyebrow. That sounds expensive. It sounds dangerous. Connor shrugged. I was aiming for mildly uncomfortable. The ambassador studied him for a moment. You do realize you're going to be famous here? Connor stood slowly. I hope not. Why? Connor straightened his jacket. Because if Terracians expect me to keep telling jokes in their language, the next one might actually start a war. The ambassador nodded thoughtfully. Fair. Connor stepped away from the terrace and followed one of the gently sloping garden paths that curved between glowing trees. The Palace of Terraces felt different at night. During the day, it was elegant and structured. Every movement seemed guided by quiet rules that stretched back through centuries of tradition. At night, the gardens felt more alive. Soft lights pulsed inside the plants. Thin streams of glowing water flowed through carved channels between the terraces. Small hovering insects made of drifting light floated between the flowers. Connor paused beside one of the water channels and watched the surface ripple. He heard footsteps behind him, soft ones. Terracians moved quietly, but Connor had already learned to recognize the subtle shift of presence when someone approached. He turned. Queen Lira stood a few steps away on the path. The silver fabric of her robes reflected the pale moonlight, and the long curve of her ears was outlined by the soft glow of nearby plants. Connor straightened slightly. Your Majesty. Lira tilted her head gently. You escaped the diplomats. Connor nodded. I have discovered that diplomats become nervous when linguists succeed. That is understandable. Connor glanced back toward the distant dining terrace. I hope I did not cause too much disruption. The Queen stepped closer, her expression thoughtful. You caused something unusual. Connor waited. My court laughed tonight. Connor smiled slightly. I noticed. They walked slowly along the terrace path together. Below them, countless garden levels stretched down the hillside, glowing softly beneath the night sky. In the distance, enormous floating vine forests drifted above the landscape like slow-moving islands. Connor glanced at them. Those are still one of the strangest things I've ever seen. The floating vines? Yes. They grow towards certain magnetic fields in the atmosphere. Connor nodded. On Earth, we mostly just argue with plants. Lira gave him a curious look. You argue with plants? Sometimes they win. The Queen's shoulders moved slightly with quiet amusement. They continued walking. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Lira said softly, For many years I have spoken the languages of others. Connor looked at her. It's a diplomatic skill. It is also a habit. She gestured lightly toward the distant palace terraces. When visitors arrive, I greet them in their language. It makes them comfortable. Connor nodded. That's good diplomacy. Yes. She paused. But over time, something changed. Connor waited. I began hearing my own language only during ceremonies. Connor's smile faded slightly. That must feel strange. It did. They stopped beside a tall flowering tree whose leaves glowed faintly blue. Lira looked out across the terraces. My people hear my language every day, she said, but they speak to me with careful formality. Connor understood immediately. Language could carry distance as easily as it carried meaning. Tonight, Lra continued, you spoke Terracian without ceremony. Connor rubbed the back of his neck. Well, slightly incorrectly. That made it better. Connor blinked. It did. You were not careful. I was terrified. That is not the same as careful. Connor thought about that. Fair point. The Queen turned toward him again. You were willing to sound foolish in order to connect. Connor gave a small shrug. Humans do that a lot. Yes, she said softly. I noticed. Connor smiled. On Earth, we believe embarrassment is the price of good communication. Lra studied him. And if the joke had failed? Connor thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. I would have apologized dramatically. And then, I probably would have blamed the translator device. The Queen laughed again. This time the sound came easily. Connor watched the glowing gardens around them and realized something surprising. The laughter no longer felt like an accident. It felt natural. Lra looked toward the floating vine forest in the distance. Perhaps tomorrow, she said, you will teach me one of your human jokes. Connor considered this carefully. Your Majesty, yes? Human jokes are extremely dangerous. Her ears lifted slightly. More dangerous than Terracian idioms? Connor nodded slowly. Much more. For a moment the Queen said nothing. Then she smiled. I look forward to the risk. Morning on Terraces did not begin with sunlight. It began with music. Soft tones drifted across the layered gardens as wind moved through tall, crystal chimes woven between the trees. The sound traveled through the terraces like a slow breath, echoing across streams, glowing plants, and bridges carved into living stone. Connor Blake stood on one of the upper garden platforms and watched the planet wake up. The floating vine forests in the distance drifted slowly across the horizon, guided by invisible magnetic currents in the upper atmosphere. Below them, Terracian gardeners moved calmly across the terraces, tending glowing flowers that reacted to the rising light of the twin suns. Connor sipped Terracian tea. He had learned something about Terracian tea. It looked harmless. It tasted excellent. And it contained enough energy to power a small spacecraft. Careful, a voice said behind him. Connor turned. Queen Lira stepped onto the terrace, her silver robes catching the early light. The long curve of her ears framed her face as she studied him with quiet amusement. You are drinking the strong one, she said. Connor glanced down at the cup. That explains why I reorganized my notes, learned 3 new Terracian verbs, and considered writing a dictionary this morning. Lra smiled. The gardeners use that tea when they must work through 2 nights. Connor slowly set the cup down. I see. They walked together along the terrace path overlooking the palace gardens. Connor had spent several weeks on Terraces now. The diplomatic negotiations between Earth and the Terracian Empire had progressed smoothly, almost suspiciously smoothly. The human ambassador had once whispered to him, I'm not saying your joke saved the negotiations, but it absolutely did. Connor wasn't sure about that, but he had noticed something else. The palace had changed, not dramatically, not officially, but subtly. During council meetings, Terracian ministers occasionally allowed themselves small smiles. Garden discussions sometimes included quiet humor. One afternoon, Connor had even overheard 2 scholars debating whether vines preferred sarcastic gardeners or optimistic ones. Connor suspected this was progress. They reached the edge of a high terrace where the view stretched across half the Capital Valley. Lra rested her hands lightly on the railing. For centuries, she said quietly, our court valued perfection. Connor nodded. That sounds exhausting. It was efficient. Efficiency and joy rarely share the same room. The Queen glanced at him. You believe that? Connor leaned on the railing. On Earth, most of our progress happens when someone makes a mistake and everyone laughs instead of panicking. That seems chaotic. Connor grinned. Oh, it absolutely is. Below them, a group of Terracian scholars crossed one of the lower bridges. Connor noticed something unusual. They were laughing. Not loudly, but unmistakably. Lra noticed too. She watched them for a long moment. When I first heard you attempt our idiom, she said, I believed you had miscalculated. Connor nodded. I did. You mispronounced a vowel. Connor held up a finger. In my defense, your vowels are extremely ambitious. The Queen's shoulders moved slightly with quiet laughter. But you were not afraid to fail. Connor considered that. I was afraid, he admitted. But you spoke anyway. Connor shrugged. That's how humans learn. Lra looked back across the terraces. For a long time, I believed a queen must always be precise, always correct, always composed. Connor tilted his head. That sounds lonely. It was. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Lra said something in Terracian. Connor blinked. You're testing me. Yes. Connor thought about the phrase carefully. It was an idiom. He recognized the structure. Something about rivers and stepping stones. He frowned. Let me guess, he said slowly. It means something wise about patience. Lra shook her head. It means, if you hesitate too long, the fish will steal your lunch. Connor stared at her. That's a terrible proverb. It is very old. Connor nodded thoughtfully. Terracian humor is improving. The Queen laughed again. The sound echoed softly across the terraces. Connor realized something. The first time he heard that laugh, it had surprised the entire palace. Now it felt normal, natural, part of the living rhythm of the gardens. Lra looked at him. You changed something here. Connor shook his head. I told one joke. You reminded us of something. Connor raised an eyebrow. What's that? That language is meant to connect people, not just impress them. Connor smiled. I learned something too. And what is that? Connor looked out across the floating vine forests, drifting slowly through the sky. That sometimes the most powerful diplomatic strategy in the galaxy is sounding slightly ridiculous in the right moment. Lra considered that carefully. That is a dangerous strategy. Connor nodded. Extremely. The Queen turned toward him. Will you return to Earth soon? Connor exhaled slowly. Yes. Will you continue studying Terracian language? Connor grinned. Oh, absolutely. And our idioms? Connor thought for a moment. Maybe just one at a time. The Queen extended her hand. Connor hesitated only briefly before shaking it. Her grip was calm and steady. Then when you return, Lra said, perhaps you will bring another joke. Connor smiled. I will. She studied him. Preferably one that does not threaten agricultural infrastructure. Connor considered that. No promises. The Queen laughed. And somewhere across the vast living terraces of her world, the sound carried through the gardens like sunlight through leaves. Warm, unexpected, and impossible to silence again.